The salt flats of Prime stretched to the horizon in every direction, white and endless under a pale orange sky. The wind never stopped here. It carried tiny crystals that stung exposed skin and wore down stone over centuries. Nothing soft lasted long on the salt flats. Thresh walked the familiar path from his dwelling to the shrine, his clawed feet crunching on the crystalline ground. He was tall and thin with iridescent scales that shifted color in the morning light. His species had evolved in the spawning caves beneath these flats, where warm underground rivers carved tunnels through ancient salt deposits. They were not made for the surface world, but Thresh had lived up here his entire adult life. 43 years of wind and salt and solitude. The shrine stood on a small rise, the only elevation for kilometers. It was built from black obsidian that they had hauled from distant volcanic regions, a material that resisted the endless erosion of salt and wind. The structure was simple, a rectangular base supporting a tall pillar, and at the pillar's top, protected by a crystal dome, a small holographic projector that displayed an image when activated. Thresh reached the shrine as the first sun crested the horizon. He knelt before the obsidian base and pressed his palm against a worn panel. The hologram flickered to life, showing a human female in a flight suit. She had dark hair pulled back from her face, and she was smiling at something outside the frame of the image. The name etched into the base read, Lieutenant Maya, Terran Expeditionary Force. He had never seen a human in person. They had left this region of space before his hatching, and none had returned in his lifetime. Everything he knew about them came from the old records and the stories his broodmother had told him when he was young. The humans were small, she had said. Smaller than, with soft skin that damaged easily and bodies that required constant temperature regulation. They should not have been able to survive in space at all, let alone fight wars among the stars. But they had fought, and they had died. Lieutenant Maya had died here, on Prime, saving a spawning colony from the swarm creatures that once infested the deep caves. Thresh removed a cloth from his carrying pouch and began to polish the obsidian base. This was his morning ritual, unchanged for 4 decades. He cleaned the stone, checked the holographic projector for damage, and refreshed the offering bowl with new salt crystals. The crystals were specially prepared, heated and compressed until they formed perfect geometric shapes that caught the light. They were the most precious things the could offer, and Thresh made sure the bowl was never empty. His broodmother had been the shrine keeper before him. She had taken the role from her own broodmother, who had witnessed the event that the shrine commemorated. The story had been passed down through 3 generations now, growing more sacred with each telling. The swarm creatures had come up from the deep caves during the spawning season, drawn by the chemical signals of eggs. Thousands of them, each the size of a small ground vehicle, with mandibles that could crush rock and armor that deflected energy weapons. The spawning colony had no defenses against such an attack. The adults could flee, but the eggs could not be moved once they were laid. The human expeditionary force had been camped on the far side of the planet, fighting their own war against the hive consciousness that controlled the swarm creatures. They had no obligation to help the 2 species had only made contact a few years earlier, and there were no treaties between them, no agreements of mutual defense. Lieutenant Maya had been flying a transport ship loaded with wounded soldiers when she received the distress signal from the spawning colony. Her ship was damaged, leaking fuel, barely able to maintain altitude. The smart thing would have been to continue to the human base camp for repairs. Instead, she turned her ship toward the spawning caves. She flew low over the swarm creatures, drawing their attention with her engine noise and heat signature. She led them away from the caves, away from the eggs, flying slower and slower as her fuel ran out and her damaged engines began to fail. The swarm followed her for nearly 100 kilometers before she finally crashed into the largest hive structure on the planet, detonating what remained of her fuel reserves and collapsing the hive entrance. She killed herself and destroyed the hive's central nest. Without the nest, the swarm creatures lost their coordination and scattered. The spawning colony survived. 7,000 eggs hatched that season, and those hatchlings grew up to have their own offspring, who had their own offspring in turn. Thresh's brood mother had been one of those eggs. He finished polishing the obsidian and stood back to inspect his work. The morning light made the black stone gleam. The hologram of Lieutenant smiled at nothing, frozen in a moment from her life before she came to this world and gave everything she had. A sound made Thresh turn. A shuttle was descending from the sky, its engine noise cutting through the constant whisper of the wind. He watched it land on the salt flats below the shrine, and 3 figures emerged. Thresh recognized the species of the first 2. The tall one with the flowing silver robes was ancient and graceful, with 4 eyes that seemed to see everything at once. The shorter one was like himself, but younger, with scales that had not yet faded to the pale gray of age. The third figure was something Thresh had never seen before, a floating sphere covered in sensor arrays, clearly some kind of automated recording device. They approached first, moving with the careful slowness of advanced age. "I am counselor of the Galactic Memorial Authority," she said, her translator device rendering her words into speech patterns. "We are here for the centennial inspection." Thresh bowed his head in acknowledgement. He had been expecting this visit, though not for several more months. "The shrine is maintained," he said. "I have kept it as my brood mother kept it before me." The young stepped forward. "I am archivist," she said. "I document the shrines for the authorities' records." She looked at the obsidian pillar, then at the hologram of Maya. "This is Site 847 VP, the memorial." Something about the way she said it bothered Thresh. She spoke as if the shrine were just a number, just one item on a list. He said nothing. Counselor walked slowly around the shrine, her 4 eyes examining every detail. She touched the obsidian with one long finger and frowned. "The foundation crystals are degrading," she said. Thresh felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "What does that mean?" They turned to face him, and there was something like pity in her expression. "The geological surveys show that this entire rise is built on a salt deposit that is dissolving faster than our previous estimates suggested. The shrine will become unstable within 10 standard years, perhaps less." "Then we must reinforce it," Thresh said. "We must find a way to protect the foundation." Counselor exchanged a glance with Archivist. The younger looked away. "The Galactic Memorial Authority maintains 1,247 shrines to human heroes across known space," said. Her voice was gentle but firm. "The Conquered Assembly has reduced our funding by significant margins over the past decade. We are currently tracking 400 shrines in similar or worse condition than this one. We do not have the resources to save them all." Thresh stared at her. "You cannot let this shrine fall." "I understand your attachment," said. "Each shrine has its keeper, and each keeper believes their shrine is the most important. But I have been doing this work for over a century. I have seen shrines restored, and I have seen shrines decommissioned. We must make choices based on limited resources." Archivist had taken out a data tablet and was recording images of the shrine. She paused at the offering bowl, examining the carefully prepared salt crystals. "The local maintenance is exceptional," she noted. "This is one of the better-kept sites in the sector." Nodded, "which makes it more likely to survive the review process, but I cannot make any promises." Thresh looked at the hologram of Lieutenant, still smiling, still frozen in that moment of life before death. He thought about his brood mother, who had spent 50 years keeping this shrine. He thought about her brood mother, who had been an egg in the caves when this human flew her burning ship into the hive. "She died for us," he said quietly. "She did not know us, she did not owe us anything, but she died for us." Counselor's 4 eyes blinked slowly, one pair after another. "Yes," she said, "they often did." Archivist had visited 17 memorial shrines before she came to Prime, and she would visit dozens more before her documentation project was complete. But something about the memorial stayed with her, as the shuttle lifted off from the salt flats and climbed toward orbit. She reviewed her recordings during the journey back to the authorities' regional headquarters. The keeper's face haunted her, that expression of desperate love for a being he had never met, from a species he had never encountered. She had seen similar devotion at other shrines, maintained by other species, but something about Thresh's quiet certainty bothered her in ways she could not name. The regional headquarters was located on a station orbiting a gas giant, far from any inhabited world. This was by design. The Memorial Authority prided itself on its neutrality, its distance from the political concerns of individual species. Its purpose was simple: maintain the shrines, preserve the memories, honor the human dead. But had begun to wonder about that purpose. She was young by standards, only 60 years past her hatching, and she had come to the authority with the idealism of youth. She believed in the mission. She believed that remembering the past was essential for building a better future. What she had not expected was how political even memory could become. Counselor met her in the archive chamber after the shuttle docked. There was reviewing budget projections, her 4 eyes scanning multiple screens simultaneously. She looked tired, though had learned that always looked tired to other species. "Your documentation of the memorial was thorough," said without looking up. "The review committee will be impressed." "Will it matter?" asked. She was surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. Paused her work and focused 2 of her eyes on. "That depends on what you think matters." Sat down across from the counselor. The archive chamber was vast and quiet, filled with data storage units that held the complete records of every memorial shrine in the network. Over 1,000 shrines, each with its own history, its own keeper, its own story of human sacrifice. She had access to all of it, and the more she read, the more confused she became. Why did they do it? She asked. The humans, why did they die for species that were not their own? His remaining eyes joined the first 2 in studying's face. That is a question many have asked. And what is the answer? There is no single answer. Turned off her screens and gave her full attention. The humans were a young species when they entered galactic society. They had barely mastered interstellar travel when the Cascade Wars began. They could have stayed in their home system, protected by distance and obscurity. The hive consciousness had not noticed them yet. They were safe. But they came anyway, said. They came anyway. They called it holding the line. They believed that if the hive consciousness consumed the outer spiral, it would eventually reach them too. So they chose to fight while the fighting was far from their home. Had read about the Cascade Wars in her training. The conflict had lasted nearly a century, spreading across hundreds of systems, involving every major species in known space. The hive consciousness was not a single enemy, but a distributed intelligence, a network of biological entities that consumed other life forms to fuel their expansion. Stopping them had required unprecedented cooperation between species that had never trusted each other before. But why did they die in such numbers? Asked. The records show human casualties far out of proportion to their population. They were not the strongest species in the coalition. They were not the most advanced. Why did they bear so much of the cost? Was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than had ever heard it. They volunteered for the dangerous missions. They took the positions that no one else wanted to hold. When a retreat was needed, humans stayed behind to cover it. When an evacuation required time, humans bought that time with their lives. That is not an explanation, said. That is just a description of what they did. I am asking why. The counselor rose from her seat and walked to one of the archive units. She activated a display, and an image appeared. A human male in military uniform, standing before a crowd of other humans. The text beneath the image identified him as Admiral Thomas, commander of the Terran Expeditionary Force during the final years of the Cascade Wars. This recording was made 60 years after the wars ended, said. Admiral was very old by then, one of the last surviving human commanders from that era. He was asked the same question you are asking now. The recording began to play. The old human's voice was rough with age, but his words were clear. People always ask why we did it, why we fought and died for worlds we had never seen, for species we had just met. They want some grand explanation, some noble philosophy that drove us. But the truth is simpler than that. We did it because we were there. We did it because we could. And when it was over, we did not ask for anything in return, because that would have made it something other than what it was. It was a gift, freely given. That is all. The recording ended, stared at the frozen image of the old admiral. "I do not understand," she said. "Neither do I," admitted. "Neither did anyone else. The humans won the respect of every species in the coalition. They could have claimed territory, demanded seats on the conquered assembly, built an empire from the gratitude they had earned. Instead, when the wars ended, they simply went home. They from galactic affairs. They stopped responding to communications. Within a generation, they had become ghosts. And no one knows why they left. There are theories. Some believe they were traumatized by the wars and needed time to heal. Some believe they were disappointed in the other species, who returned to their old conflicts and rivalries as soon as the common enemy was defeated. Some believe it was always their plan to withdraw, that they never intended to be permanent members of galactic society. Paused. And some believe they are still out there, watching, waiting to see what we do with the future they bought with their blood. Looked around the archive chamber at the thousands of storage units containing records of human heroism. "The Memorial Authority," she said slowly. "Who founded it?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "You have been doing your research." "I found references in the early records, but they were incomplete. The authority's origins seemed deliberately obscured." The counselor was silent for a long moment. Then she walked to a particular archive unit and entered a lengthy access code. A file appeared on the display, marked with the highest security classification had ever seen. "The Galactic Memorial Authority was founded 103 years ago," said. "It was proposed, designed, and initially funded by the Terran Diplomatic Service. The humans created this organization to maintain memorials to their own dead, because they knew that once no one else would do it." Felt something cold settle in her chest. They knew they were going to leave. They planned for it. They created the authority, established the initial network of shrines, trained the first generation of caretakers, and set up funding mechanisms that would continue to operate without human oversight. Then they transferred control to a coalition of other species and disappeared. But why? No one knows. The last human representative to serve on the authority's board died 60 years ago. He never explained their reasons, no matter how many times he was asked. Close the file. The other species have managed the authority ever since. We have tried to honor the mission the humans gave us, but with each generation the memory fades, the budget shrinks, the shrines decay. Thought about the keeper on Prime, polishing the obsidian pillar every morning, filling the offering bowl with sacred salt crystals. She thought about all the other keepers she had met, on all the other worlds, performing their own rituals of remembrance. None of them knew that the system they served had been designed by the very beings they honored. "I want to see more," she said. "Not just the shrines in this sector. I want to understand the whole network." Counselor studied her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because something does not make sense. The humans created this authority to ensure their dead would be remembered. That suggests they care deeply about memory, about legacy. But they also completely from galactic society, cutting off all contact. Those two things contradict each other. People who care about being remembered do not simply vanish." The four eyes blinked in sequence. "What do you think it means?" Did not have an answer, but she intended to find one. Over the following year, traveled to 37 memorial shrines on 19 different worlds. She documented each site, interviewed each keeper, and studied the local traditions that had grown up around the human dead. She found patterns that no one had noticed before because no one had thought to look. The shrines were not randomly distributed. They clustered around certain types of locations, major population centers, critical infrastructure nodes, places where a small intervention could have enormous consequences. The humans had not died in random acts of heroism. They had positioned themselves, deliberately, at the points where their sacrifice would save the most lives. On a water world called 3, she visited the memorial to a human dive team that had drowned repairing flood barriers during a catastrophic storm. The barriers protected the largest city on the planet, home to 3 million aquatic beings. The dive team had known their equipment was failing. They had gone down anyway. On an asteroid station at the edge of space, she stood before the memorial to a human engineer named Sarah, who had vented herself into space to seal a hull breach that would have killed everyone on the station. She had lived for 11 minutes in hard vacuum, using her body to block the breach while her activated the emergency seals. The station's population had been 847 souls, mostly refugees fleeing the hive consciousness. On Counselor Zone, a mountainous planet called Prime, found the largest human memorial she had yet encountered. It commemorated an entire battalion, 2,400 soldiers who had held a mountain pass for 6 days against overwhelming hive forces, buying time for 400,000 civilians to evacuate through the only safe corridor. None of the humans survived. At each site, she found the same thing: local species who maintained the shrines with fierce devotion, passing the duty from generation to generation, teaching their young the stories of human sacrifice. They did this without any guidance from the memorial authority, without any incentive or reward. They did it because they believed they owed a debt that could never be fully repaid. When returned to the regional headquarters, she brought her findings to Counselor. The old listened without interruption as laid out her conclusions. The humans were not just brave, said. They were strategic. They studied the galactic situation, identified the critical points, and placed themselves where their deaths would have maximum impact. This was not random heroism. This was planned sacrifice on a scale. Nodded slowly. I have suspected something similar for many years, but I never had the evidence to prove it. There is more, said. She activated her data tablet and displayed a map of known space, with each human memorial marked as a point of light. I analyzed the distribution of shrines against the movement of the hive consciousness during the Cascade Wars. The correlation is almost perfect. Every major human sacrifice occurred at a location where the hive was about to achieve a strategic breakthrough. Every time they were about to win, humans died to stop them. You are saying the humans knew where the critical battles would be fought. I am saying they engineered it. They did not just respond to crises. They predicted them, positioned themselves in advance, and gave their lives at exactly the right moments to change the course of the war. Paused, hardly believing her own words. They sacrificed themselves with mathematical precision. Counselor was quiet for a long time. Her 4 eyes stared at the map of lights, each one representing dozens or hundreds of human dead. Finally, she spoke. If what you say is true, then the humans did not withdraw from galactic society because they were traumatized or disappointed. Because their work was done. They had bought the future they intended to buy, and they had nothing more to give. Nodded, but they left the shrines. They created the memorial authority. They wanted us to remember. The question, said softly, is what they wanted us to remember. Before could respond, an alert chimed from the station's communication system. One of the sensor technicians appeared on the display, looking confused and slightly frightened. Counselor, the technician said, we are detecting an anomaly at the edge of mapped space. The signal pattern matches century-old human communication protocols. And looked at each other, neither spoke, neither needed to. After 100 years of silence, the humans might be calling. The conquered assembly met in emergency session for the first time in 30 years. Representatives from all 12 member species crowded into the great chamber on the assembly station, their translators working overtime to render a dozen languages into mutual understanding. The signal from the edge of space had changed everything. Watched from the observer's gallery as Counselor addressed the assembly. The old looked even more tired than usual, but her voice was strong. The signal originated from a location approximately 40 light-years beyond our current border, reported. It appears to be a navigational beacon designed to guide ships toward a specific destination. The protocols it uses are unmistakably human in origin. "Are we certain this is not some form of deception?" asked the representative, a massive being who communicated through complex patterns of bioluminescence. "A trap laid by hostile forces." "We cannot be certain of anything," admitted. "The beacon has been transmitting for some time, possibly decades. We only detected it now because one of our long-range sensor arrays was recently upgraded to scan frequency ranges that the original human communication protocols utilized." "What does the Memorial Authority recommend?" asked the representative, an elderly female named who had been a vocal advocate for preserving the human shrines. Paused. This was the moment she had been preparing for since the signal was first detected. "The Memorial Authority recommends that we send a single ship to investigate the beacon. We believe this may be an invitation from the humans, a first step toward renewed contact." The chamber erupted in argument. Some representatives demanded immediate investigation. Others counseled caution, warning of unknown dangers. Still others questioned whether contact with the humans was even desirable, given how much had changed in the century since their withdrawal. Stopped listening to the debate. Her attention was fixed on a small display in her hand, showing real-time data from the sensor arrays. The beacon was still transmitting, steady and patient, waiting for someone to follow its signal home. She thought about Lieutenant Maya flying her burning ship into the hive. She thought about Sarah using her body to seal a hull breach. She thought about 2,400 soldiers holding a mountain pass for 6 days, knowing none of them would survive. She thought about all the shrines, all the keepers, all the generations of devotion to beings who had given everything and asked for nothing. "Why did you save us?" she wondered, "and why did you leave?" 2 months later, stood on the bridge of a diplomatic vessel as it approached the coordinates indicated by the beacon. She had volunteered for the mission against Counselor's advice, arguing that her research into the Memorial Network made her uniquely qualified to serve as the authority's representative. In truth, she simply could not bear to wait while others discovered the answers to the questions that had consumed her. The ship carried a crew of 15, drawn from 5 different species. They had been traveling for 6 weeks through unexplored space, following the beacon's signal deeper into the unknown. Now, finally, they had arrived. The destination was a star system with a single habitable world, blue and green and white, achingly similar to images had seen of the human. But the planet was not their goal. The beacon led them to an artificial structure in orbit, a station of impossible size, larger than any construction had ever seen. "I am reading hundreds of ships docked at the station," reported the sensor operator, a young whose bioluminescence flickered with excitement. "The designs match historical records of human vessels." Stared at the humans were here. They had been here all along, just beyond the edge of known space, waiting. A communication signal arrived before they could decide whether to attempt contact. The flickered, and a human face appeared. It was a woman, middle-aged by human standards, with gray streaking her dark hair. She wore a simple uniform with no visible rank insignia. "Welcome," the woman said. "We have been expecting you. My name is Admiral, and on behalf of the Terran Continuity Council, I invite you to dock at Station Memorial. We have much to discuss." Found her voice. Why now? Why after 100 years of silence? Admiral smiled, and there was something sad in her expression. Because you finally came looking for us. We were never hiding. We were waiting to see if you remembered. The shrines said, the memorial authority. A test, confirmed, and a gift. We gave you our dead and we asked you to honor them. We wanted to know if you would. We wanted to know if the future we bought with our blood was worth the price. Her smile widened slightly. For 100 years we watched. We saw the shrines maintained. We saw the keepers pass their duties to the next generation. We saw your species remember our sacrifice, even when there was no advantage in remembering. And now you have passed the test. You came looking for answers, which means you still care about the questions. The galaxy we saved has become worthy of saving. Admiral leaned forward. Welcome to Station Memorial Archivist. We have a lot of history to share and a lot of future to build. 3 months after the first contact at Station Memorial, Thresh received a visitor at his shrine on Prime. The human was small, as the old stories described, with soft skin and strange round eyes. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Commander, and she had traveled across the galaxy to stand before her ancestors' memorial. Thresh watched her touch the obsidian pillar, trace the letters of Maya's name with her fingertips. Her eyes were wet with the fluid that humans produced when they felt strong emotions. I never met her, Lieutenant Commander said quietly. She died 200 years before I was born, but I grew up hearing stories about her. Every human child does. We remember all of them, every person who gave their life during the Cascade Wars. We could never forget. Why did you stay away so long? Thresh asked. The human turned to face him. Because we needed to know if our sacrifice meant anything. We died for species we had just met, for worlds we had never seen. We did it because we believed that life was worth protecting, no matter whose life it was. But belief is not enough. We needed to know if the species we saved would remember that belief, or if they would forget us as soon as the danger passed. We never forgot, Thresh said. No, Lieutenant Commander agreed. You never did, and now we can come home. She pulled a small object from her pocket and held it out to Thresh. It was a medal, tarnished with age, bearing an insignia he did not recognize. This belonged to my ancestor, said. I want you to have it, to add to the shrine if you will accept it. Thresh took the medal carefully, feeling its weight in his palm. I will guard it with my life. The human smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the hologram that Thresh had polished every morning for 40 years. I know you will. That is why she died for your people, because she knew that you would be worth it. The wind carried salt crystals across the flats, stinging and eternal. The shrine stood on its small rise, obsidian gleaming in the orange light. And for the first time in a century, humans stood together before it, remembering the past and looking toward a future that had been purchased, long ago, with the most precious currency of all. The galaxy would never forget, and the humans had finally come home.